Michael Carter, CEO of the Sunrise Cafe restaurant chain, was once the epitome of a leader who was both strict and compassionate, someone who always believed in the value of kindness and community in business. On the day he laid the first bricks to build Sunrise Cafe, he believed that a successful business was not just built on the quality of its coffee or the fame of its pancakes, but also on the relationships nurtured at the bar counter, at the dining tables, among employees and customers. In those days, the cafe was filled with laughter, the scent of pastries lingered in the air, and the warm yellow light glowed on every smiling face. Michael proudly stood among his staff, shaking their hands, calling them by name, and promising that Sunrise Cafe would always be their second home, a place where kindness and respect would lead the way. But as time passed, the business grew, and branches opened across the city. Along with that growth came lengthy reports, revenue figures, employee turnover rates, and customer satisfaction statistics. Michael had once believed that those reports were the most truthful reflection of Sunrise Cafe, but gradually, he realized that those numbers were cold, soulless, and lacked the most important thing, the heartbeat of the people who had built this brand with him. Recently, the reports flooding into the CEO's office had only bad news: unusually high turnover rates, declining revenue, and complaints from customers about service. Michael read them in his spacious, modern office on the top floor, where the LED lights glowed brightly and everything was neatly arranged. But in that room, he felt disconnected from the true breath of Sunrise Cafe, the breath of those early mornings when staff stacked pastries on the shelves, the smell of coffee filled the space, the cheerful greetings, and the weary sighs after a long shift. One drizzly evening, Michael stood by the glass window in his office, looking down at the street. Raindrops fell on the glass like silent tears he had never noticed. Beneath the dim streetlights, the cafe still glowed, and he knew, down there were employees working, there were smiles, there were drops of sweat falling behind the counter, there were small dreams being nurtured. And perhaps there were also struggles he had never known. He felt a strong urge in his chest, an urge to leave his high tower of power, to return to the very place where he had laid those first bricks. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, to hear it with his own ears, and to feel it with his own heart, the heartbeat of Sunrise Cafe. The next morning, Michael woke up earlier than usual. He opened his wardrobe, brushed past the expensive suits, and stopped at the old, worn-out flannel shirt and the baseball cap he had worn in the early days when he personally served coffee to customers. The shirt was frayed at the shoulders, the cap stained with sweat at the brim, but every mark on them reminded him of the days when every employee was called by name and every customer was met with a smile. Michael put on those old clothes, partly as a disguise, partly to remind himself of the core values he had once believed in. A successful business is one that does not abandon the people who built its brand. He left the office through the back door, avoiding the curious stares of assistants and senior managers. A light rain fell, with drops sliding down the car window, reminiscent of those rainy days when he first drove to the grand opening of the first Sunrise Cafe branch. This time, he was not the powerful CEO, he was Michael Carter, an ordinary man, seeking the breath of a dream that had been overshadowed by cold, lifeless numbers. His steps stopped in front of the glass door of a local Sunrise Cafe branch, the place that once filled him with pride, the place that had welcomed thousands of customers, the place where he had once heard the bright laughter of staff sharing hot pancakes. The warm yellow lights were still there, and the sweet scent of pastries still lingered in the air, making him shiver with the memory of those early mornings inspecting the quality of the baked goods. But instead of the lively laughter and chatter, he sensed a gloom creeping between indifferent eyes, shoulders bent with exhaustion, and hurried steps that seemed to want to escape something. The atmosphere in the cafe felt colder, and the clinking of cups and plates sounded like a harsh note in a sad song. Michael sat down on an iron chair near the bar, his hands trembling as he placed his coffee cup on the worn wooden table. His eyes followed every staff member, every glance. Every gesture stabbed at his heart with an indescribable pain. He suddenly realized it was this place and these very people busy at work that were the soul of Sunrise Cafe, not the lifeless numbers on the reports. Michael remained still, quietly observing every corner of the cafe he once called his second home. In front of him was the pastry counter, where in the old days, staff would line up the pastries neatly, smiling proudly at every customer. Today, that counter still displayed hot pastries, but it exuded a loneliness, as if the person behind it had lost their joy. His eyes shifted to the clock on the wall. The second hand still ticked steadily, each rotation representing days he had missed, days spent buried in meetings, endless reports, and unfulfilled promises. His heart sank at the thought of those staff behind the bar. They were still here, still smiling politely, but behind those eyes were worries he had never fully understood. A young male staff member in his 20s, wearing a worn-out apron, was busy wiping a table near the window. His eyes briefly flickered with anxiety, glancing toward the manager before quickly lowering his head. Michael noticed the cleaning cloth in the young man's hand had become discolored. The edges frayed a small detail, but enough for him to feel the fragility of the system he had once proudly built as a family. Nearby, a girl with neatly tied hair carefully arranged leftover pastries, moving slowly as if she feared dropping something precious. The yellow light from the overhead lamp shone on her shadowed eyes, a look that held sleepless nights and unspoken worries. Michael wondered, how long had she been forcing herself to live, to smile at customers, without letting a single tear slip through? His eyes wandered to the large window, where the raindrops still clung, drawing long streaks down the glass. Each drop slid down slowly, taking with it the image of small dreams fading away. In that distant gaze, he saw the faces he had once shaken hands with on opening day. Now they were gone, or still here but with unfamiliar eyes. The cafe's atmosphere felt more suffocating than ever. Michael felt his breath heavy, his shoulders burdened with an invisible weight. He looked up at the Sunrise Cafe sign hanging neatly on the wall, the yellow light reflecting off the familiar letters. But now it felt like a huge question. Is this still the Sunrise Cafe he had worked so hard to build? He placed his hand on the table, feeling the worn wood grain, like the path he had walked with Sunrise Cafe. His hand trembled, not from the cold, but from a pang of guilt. His heart ached as he recalled the promises he'd made on the very first day. Sunrise Cafe will always be a place where every employee is valued, a place where no one is left behind. Michael took a deep breath. The smell of coffee still filled the air, but it couldn't chase away the chill in his heart. His breath emerged in a thin, fragile mist, like the faith he was trying so hard to hold on to. His eyes swept across the bar one last time, where the light reflected off droplets clinging to the glass. For a brief moment, he caught his own blurry reflection, a middle-aged man, his eyes filled with more questions than answers, his hand gripping the coffee cup as if holding on to something precious. In that moment, Michael knew, if he didn't reclaim the true spirit of Sunrise Cafe today, tomorrow would bring nothing but cold numbers and soulless reports. He would forever be the man on the top floor looking down, forgetting that Sunrise Cafe had begun with eye contact, sweat, and small dreams. And then he took a deep breath, silently telling himself, this is the moment I must stand up and become a part of Sunrise Cafe, not just a CEO on paper. Michael sat quietly at the bar, the warmth of his old flannel shirt unable to dispel the cold that seeped into his heart. His fingers gently tapped on the worn wooden table, his eyes searching every corner of the cafe for familiar faces. He remembered the days when every staff member would beam when they saw him walk into the cafe, holding up a freshly made pancake, calling him by his name, not just by his title. But that scene was gone this morning. The laughter and chatter had disappeared, replaced by hurried footsteps and avoiding eyes. The cafe's breath felt stifled, its sounds fragmented, disconnected like the weakening heartbeat of Sunrise Cafe. His eyes rested on the menu board at the bar, the yellow light shining down, highlighting the scratches along its edges, marks of time, from countless busy mornings when staff hands had touched it over and over. His fingers gently brushed those scratches, as if trying to grasp a piece of the past. A voice softly called him back to the present. Olivia, the young waitress, approached, her hand trembling slightly as she set a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The yellow light highlighted the dark circles under her eyes and the messy strands of hair that hadn't had a chance to be tidied. Her breath formed a thin mist, carrying the scent of coffee mixed with the weariness of long nights at work. Michael looked at her for a long time, his eyes meeting hers, where a nameless sadness lingered. For a moment, it felt as though the entire cafe had fallen silent, only the sound of his own pounding heart and the flickering yellow light remained. Olivia bit her lip gently, her voice trembling, as if she had to summon all her courage just to say it. I have to skip breakfast to be able to work here. Tips aren't even enough to pay for rent anymore. Each word hit like a cold blade, cutting straight into Michael's heart. The hot coffee in his hand suddenly turned bitter, its bitterness mixing with the sour taste of the truth that Sunrise Cafe had lost what he once believed to be its core value, kindness and fairness for those who worked hard every day. He shuddered, his fingers trembling, his eyes lingering on Olivia's face as though he wanted to ask her something, to share, to reach out and comfort her. But every word caught in his throat. In the yellow light, a tear rolled down Olivia's cheek. That tear made him feel like he was being crushed. His breath quickened, and he gripped the coffee cup tightly, as if trying to hold on to the last warmth of faith. But that warmth was fading, like a candle flame flickering out. Michael looked around, his eyes scanning the quiet faces, the worn-out uniforms, the unfinished trays of pastries. He heard the coffee machine whirring tiredly, like Sunrise Cafe itself gasping for breath. In that moment, he understood. Sunrise Cafe was no longer the kind place it once was. The promises of a warm home, of fair sharing, of the smiles of those who stood beside him, all of it now existed only in memory. He closed his eyes for a second, his heart constricting as though an invisible hand were squeezing it. In that suffocating moment, he wondered, how had he, Michael Carter, the founder of Sunrise Cafe, allowed this to happen under his own roof? Michael loosened his grip on the coffee cup, its warmth now just a fading reminder that everything was slipping away faster than he could imagine. He took a deep breath, but the air in the cafe felt thick, as if even his breath was being held captive. In that moment, he noticed small details he'd never paid attention to before. A stained rag draped over the back of a chair, its threads fraying. A staff member fumbling with the cash register, his face tense, fingers awkward on the keys, his eyes darting nervously as if afraid of being caught. In the corner of the cafe, the yellow light shone down on the face of a young employee cleaning up cups, his expression haggard as though he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in ages. Michael's eyes returned to Olivia. She still stood like a statue, her small hands trembling, her eyes downcast, her tired lashes trembling slightly. Her voice broke, though she still tried to keep it steady to avoid the curious eyes of the customers. Her hand rested on the edge of the counter, her slender fingers cracked from the cleaning chemicals, the dry skin split open and rough. Michael felt as if he could hear his own heart, beating a slower, heavier beat, like a drum urging him to do something. Memories of the early days came flooding back, images of Olivia in her brand new uniform, her eyes sparkling with hope, holding the menu with a radiant smile. But now, that smile had been replaced by a look of deep worry. Suddenly, Michael noticed the clicking sound of the old coffee machine, a slow, weary sound, like Sunrise Cafe itself was exhausted. The machine's rhythm was no longer steady, sometimes stopping, sometimes cutting out, like a warning that something deep inside was decaying. Michael gripped his coffee cup tighter, as if trying to cling to something that could preserve the last breath of faith. But the coffee was cold, the thin layer of foam on top as still as a lake. The aroma of coffee, which he used to pride himself on, claiming Sunrise Cafe did better than anywhere else, had now faded. He raised his eyes to the Sunrise Cafe sign on the wall, the letters still lit by the yellow light, but in his eyes, they suddenly seemed foreign. Those letters were no longer symbols of trust and dreams, but a mask hiding something rotten inside. The yellow light shone on Olivia's face, casting a long shadow on the tiled floor. Her shadow trembled on the wall, just like the voice she had just spoken. In that darkness, Michael seemed to see hundreds of employees standing beside her, people he once called family now raising their hands, waiting for him to reclaim justice for them. His heart tightened. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders, and more than anything, the pain of knowing that he, Michael Carter, the founder of Sunrise Cafe, had been the one to let this happen. A tired breath escaped, spreading through the gloomy atmosphere. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the faint echoes from afar, the cheerful laughter of the early days, the voices calling his name, the enthusiastic shout of "Order up" from the kitchen. All of it now, just memories. Michael knew, from this moment, he could no longer turn his back. He was no longer just a CEO in a high tower, no longer someone who stood outside of real conversations. He had to come back to stand among the cafe, to listen to every sigh, every silent pain, every tear from Olivia and countless others like her. He looked at her, the tear still glistening on her cheek. In the yellow light, that tear looked like a shining gem, like a final reminder. If you don't stand up, who will stand up for us? Michael took a deep breath, and his eyes lit up with a new determination, the determination of a man about to do what he should have done long ago. Michael sat quietly on the old wooden chair near the bar, his eyes following every movement of the staff. Each step, each look they exchanged, seemed to paint a picture starkly different from what he once believed. A young employee with a bright smile, a relaxed stride, and a brand new apron walked past him. His eyes shone with a confidence bordering on arrogance, the look of someone who knew he was being favored. Michael tilted his head slightly, listening to the mocking laughter coming from that young man at the coffee counter, not even bothering to hide his conspiratorial glances at the manager standing behind the bar. That young man claimed the fattest tips, as if everything had been prearranged. Meanwhile, Olivia quietly collected each empty cup, her hands trembling every time they reached for the chip tips jar at the end of the bar. The yellow light shone on her messy hair, highlighting each thin strand like the last ounce of her strength. In her eyes, Michael saw a sad, resigned look that sometimes flickered with a fragile hope, only to fade away quickly whenever the manager walked past. The POS system that Michael had once proudly viewed as a symbol of transparency had now become a tool to suffocate fairness. He saw that same young man, the one with the smug look, earlier rapidly tapping on the screen. The pale greenish light from the POS reflected on his face, accentuating an expression that mixed worry with a hint of triumph. Michael knew all too well that, in just a few brief moments, every hard-earned tip could be siphoned from the honest to the deceitful, and no report could ever reflect that. The receipt printer buzzed nonstop, its rhythm steady but soulless. Each slip that emerged from the machine felt like a death certificate for the trust that Michael had once nurtured. He watched as Olivia picked up a receipt, her eyes clouded with an indescribable sadness, her lips trembling as if to say something but then stopping. She carefully tucked the slip into an old notebook hidden beneath the cleaning cloth. Michael's eyes wandered to the clocks hanging on the wall, the second hands ticking slowly, as if witnessing every weak breath of Sunrise Cafe. Under the gloomy yellow light, everything seemed distorted, the lively chatter of the old days now nothing but scattered fragments. At the bar, a customer stood waiting for his coffee, his eyes suspiciously scanning the POS. Michael saw the man's eyebrows furrow at the sight of the tip amount on the receipt. Then he shook his head, his gaze filled with doubt. In that moment, Michael felt the trust of the customers wavering too. His heart clenched tight. The cold numbers and reports that he had once believed to be proof of growth now felt like invisible knives cutting into the very trust of those who were struggling to keep Sunrise Cafe alive. The once cheerful laughter, the warm, "have a great day," wishes now rang out flatly, missing the warmth he had once been so proud of. Michael looked at Olivia one more time. Her eyes still shimmered with unshed tears, containing all the trust, dreams, and exhaustion she had carried for so many days. The yellow light cast her shadow long on the wooden counter, like the shadow of Sunrise Cafe itself, slowly fading away. Michael slowly exhaled, the thin stream of air dissolving into the dense scent of coffee and baked goods. He felt every muscle in his body stretched taut like an over-tightened guitar string. His heart pounded harder, pounding with the growing weight of his disappointment. Another staff member, thin and with his face hidden under the brim of a cap, approached the counter with a small piece of paper. He carefully placed the paper in the manager's hand, his eyes flickering with caution, then quickly turned away. Michael recognized that look, the look of someone who knew something was wrong but didn't have the strength to speak up. He glanced at the pause machine, its pale green light blinking, each digit on the screen scrolling like a heartless song. All the tip data was being processed, and Michael knew that just a few taps could steal the sweat and effort of people like Olivia without leaving a trace. The yellow overhead lights wavered, casting their glow onto the glass behind the bar, where Michael saw his own reflection, blurred in the film of condensation. That reflection, fuzzy and indistinct, was like his own fading trust. A faint sigh drifted from the corner of the counter. Michael turned and caught sight of Olivia standing there, her metal tray tilting, about to fall. Her hands were trembling, her eyes cast downward as she tried to hide the tear ready to spill from her lashes. Behind her, the quiet laughter of the young staffer still rang out, but now it felt like a dagger stabbing deep into his heart. Michael gripped the edge of the chair tightly, his eyes sweeping across each face, the staff standing there, some with their hands behind their backs, some bowing their heads as they wiped tables as if afraid to be caught in trouble. He realized fear had seeped into every corner of Sunrise Cafe. No one dared to hold their head high to greet the morning light, the same light he had once proudly called the light of family. And sight too. In that moment, Michael saw Olivia's eyes lift, her gaze filled with a pleading look, like a silent cry that she no longer had the strength to stand alone. He saw the tear tracks left on her cheeks. Those marks, to him, were a reminder of the responsibility of a founder. At the corner of the counter, the yellow light reflected off the stacked receipts, the white paper smudged with fingerprints and faded ink. Michael saw a receipt just printed out, still hanging from the POS machine, a tip amount so small it was almost insulting, next to a strange line of text he'd never seen on any official report. A tiny line, nearly hidden beneath layers of data, like a whisper of truth struggling to break free. He turned and looked at the customer who was still waiting. The man slowly scanned the receipt, then looked directly at Michael with an unmistakable disappointment. In that moment, Michael understood that if he didn't act now, Sunrise Cafe would lose not only the trust of its employees, but also the trust of the customers who had loved the place for years. A cold draft swept through the cracked door, making the curtains flutter. The weak yellow light flickered, casting long shadows on the worn floor tiles. In that shadow, Michael saw himself no longer the powerful CEO, but a man witnessing his own dream, being suffocated by the very people he had once trusted with its care. The manager lowered his head, his shoulders trembling like a branch in the wind, his eyes darkening as he realized there was no way out. Another employee, younger, stood by the POS, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape, but his feet were rooted to the floor, unable to move. The yellow light suddenly caught the tears streaming down Olivia's cheeks. Her eyes looked at Michael, shining with trust. For the first time in so many weary days, she saw justice being named. A sigh of relief rose from a corner of the cafe, small sounds like the first rays of dawn breaking through the dark room. Michael stood tall, his eyes sweeping the cafe, where every gaze was waiting for him to make the final decision. He knew this moment was the turning point of Sunrise Cafe, where a CEO decided to stand with his employees or continue to be the one perched high above. Michael's voice lowered, but the sound still carried, like the pounding heartbeat of everyone standing there. In that dense air, he felt every eye, Olivia's, the worried eyes of employees huddled behind the counter, the surprised eyes of the customer with the cup of coffee all focused on him, waiting for an ending that could change everything. He raised his shoulders and lifted the stack of evidence higher so that everyone could see every number, every blood-red line on the white paper. His voice rose, angry but restrained. "I once believed you would bring justice and smiles to my employees, but this is their blood and sweat stolen by you." A sudden cold wind slipped through the glass door, making the signboard tremble, the yellow light flicker, casting a faint shadow on the wall. In that light, the wrinkles on Michael's forehead became clear, like the marks of sleepless nights, of decisions he could no longer deny. The manager began to tremble. His lips moved, as if to defend himself, but no words came out. His eyes flickered with fear before dropping, like a crumpled piece of paper. Michael saw clearly. That was the look of a man who knew he had lost, who had let greed and power cloud his judgment. Another employee, a young woman with brown hair falling to her shoulders, stepped out from behind the counter. Her eyes looked at Michael, shining with both admiration and worry. She clenched the dish towel in her hand, as if it could help her hold on to her courage. In that moment, Michael realized, every employee here was looking for an anchor, for someone strong enough to stand up and speak for them. Michael lifted his head high, his eyes scanning the cafe, his lips pressed together to hold back his emotions. He saw the scattered customers in the cafe also looking up at him. In their eyes were curiosity, worry, and a sense of anticipation, as if they were watching a play, but the main character was the very trust they placed in Sunrise Cafe. He took a deep breath, his voice low but steely. Sunrise Cafe was not built on lies and injustice. It was built on trust, on handshakes, and the smiles of all of you. I cannot let those who exploit that trust continue to harm this place. A few sighs of relief rose from the corner of the cafe, like small rays of sunshine shining into the dim room. Olivia quickly wiped away the tear lingering on her cheek, her eyes brightening with a hope that Michael hadn't seen in a long time. He turned, pointing at the POS system, the place where dishonest numbers had been altered in the dark. From today, every transaction, every tip, every shift assignment will be monitored transparently in front of everyone, and anyone behind this injustice will be held accountable. His voice was as firm as steel. The air in the cafe tightened like a taut string on an instrument raised to its highest pitch. The rustling of paper in his hands sounded like a final indictment. In the flickering yellow light, Michael saw each face relax, as if freed from an invisible burden. A young employee whispered to a colleague, Finally, someone has the courage to step up. Michael stood tall, his eyes glistening with tears not of weakness, but of a CEO who had finally chosen to stand with the very people he once called family. In that moment, he knew. The dream of Sunrise Cafe might have cracked, but this very moment would be the one for him and everyone else to start rebuilding that trust, one brick at a time. Outside the glass door, the morning sun pierced through the dark clouds, shining straight into the cafe. That light shone on Michael's face like a promise. This is a new beginning, for him and for Sunrise Cafe. That morning, the sunlight streamed through the window glass, painting soft beams of light on the tiled floor, chasing away the heavy atmosphere of days past. The Sunrise Cafe seemed to wear a new coat, not just because of the light, but because the bustling spirit was gradually returning. Olivia stood behind the birthplace where she had shared so many joys and sorrows, wearing a new, shining name tag, Olivia Shift Manager. Her hair was neatly tied, her eyes sparkled with confidence, but still carried a hint of emotion. Every step she took now bore the pride of someone who had weathered the storm and remained standing. Michael stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes following Olivia with a pride he couldn't hide. He saw her patiently instructing a new employee on how to check receipts on the new POS system. The POS screen shone clearly, displaying each transaction transparent, fair, with no shadows for anyone to exploit. He remembered yesterday, when he himself had signed off on the installation of the new system, not because it was more modern, but because it proved that Sunrise Cafe was ready to fix its mistakes, ready to step out of the darkness. Olivia leaned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the neatly arranged tables and chairs before resting on Michael. That look wasn't just gratitude, it was also a promise. She would protect this place. She would preserve Sunrise Cafe, just as he had once promised everyone. Michael took a deep breath, and the heavy feeling that had burdened him for so long seemed to lift. He knew well that the success of a business wasn't only measured by the revenue reports framed and hung on the wall, but rather by the confident eyes and genuine smiles of the people who had shed sweat and tears to keep this place alive. He turned to look at the other employees one by one, each face now shone with newfound confidence. Gone were the hesitant postures and averted gazes of people who feared the manager. Instead, there were eyes that knew they were respected and empowered to demand their rightful share. A regular customer walked in, smiling warmly at Olivia, then turning to Michael, nodding like a silent thank you. Michael responded with a warm smile, the smile of a CEO who had learned the greatest lesson, that kindness and fairness are the heart of an authentic Sunrise Cafe. He heard the POS machine ring out every time a customer paid now. It sounded like a hopeful tune, like a small bell heralding a new beginning. Justice isn't something far away. It exists in the way a CEO knows how to place the right people in the right positions, and most importantly, to have the courage to correct mistakes when necessary. This is an inspiring leadership lesson, reminding us that kindness and fairness are the solid foundation for any business. Only when a business knows how to listen and stand by its people can it truly be strong and enduring.